Arkham Asylum is one of the most important books in Grant Morrison's career, but what about the other Batman book that they did around this time that no one seems to mention? Hey guys, it's me Marcus aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Grant Morrison and illustrated by Dave McKean, Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth was published as a standalone graphic novel by DC Comics in October of 1989, and the Joker has taken over the asylum. With a plan to push the Dark Knight's sanity beyond its limits, he will be forced to confront the very foes that he put behind bars. But what if he can't forget the horrors that he experiences? And what if the man who built Arkham Asylum has more skeletons in his closet than those who are in prison there now? What can you say about Arkham Asylum that hasn't already been said? That's something I struggled with when thinking about this review, but fortunately, I'm more interested in where this fits within the story of Morrison's career. And the reason I believe this is Grant's homecoming is because of who the title character is. Sure, Animal Man was great, but Buddy was mostly unheard of, so if the run had failed, it wouldn't have been compared to much. With Doom Patrol, Grant was asked to take over the title because of poor readership. So if that had failed, they'd have just been the last-ditch attempt to save a sinking ship. But a Batman book? During the years following The Dark Knight Returns, releasing in the same year as his first big-screen movie since the 60s, this was the big time. He couldn't afford to fail. But to quell the dramatics, it's no secret that Morrison succeeded here, because of how highly it's praised 35 years after it was released. And the primary reason for that is because Arkham is as much the main character as Batman. In fact, the original title for this book doesn't even mention Batman. Want to know how I knew that? Because for some reason, this book has about 7 title pages. I'm a dumb reader, but even I didn't forget what I was reading that quickly. And with The Dark Knight having gone through a reinvention in the years just before this, and even the relationship between he and his arch nemesis had a very high profile title just a year earlier with The Killing Joke. It was a bold move to instead shift the focus to a staple of the lore that is often taken for granted. Now, sure, Arkham Asylum is an icon, the Gothic setting full of story potential, thanks to the movie appearances, TV show scenes, the phenomenal video game series. All of that can probably be traced back to how Morrison made the asylum the focal point of their biggest opportunity to date over at DC. We open with the pages from the Journal of Amadeus Arkham, which immediately sets the tone. The history takes priority over the present day. We see a young Amadeus bringing food to his ill mother, only for a stream of insects to cascade from her mouth, which was so pivotal to the young boy they became the symbol of his life's work. And that's how the asylum found a way to become a character. It's not just because of the drab decor or the ensemble of villains it houses, but because of the journey it took to get there when Amadeus built it. Honestly, his story was more interesting than the one taking place between Batman and the Joker. Not saying that part of the book's bad, it's just that there was more intrigue stirred up from the Amadeus storyline. And because Morrison intersected this backstory between the action and the present, I found myself wanting to spend more time with the Amadeus plot. But the breaks help with the time skips, as the next scene with him takes place decades later, returning to his family home as an adult after his mother's suspicious death. The way this unraveled was spot on, with it first being perceived as her slitting her own throat, but the doubt was there from the first time that Amadeus mentioned it. In previous Morrison books, I'd enjoyed the way narration had been handled, but often found the context of it to be lacking, giving me the feeling that it was just kind of there as stylistic padding. But that wasn't an issue here. Arkham spoke with brevity like you'd expect when you see your local doctor, even when recounting the details of his conversations with Hawkins. The analytical descriptions, the blunt, emotionless depictions made the subject matter all the more grim. In a way, it created a greater sense of distance, because on that first reading I'd hoped that Amadeus could come out the other side, similar to how I hoped that Batman would do the same with the Joker's trap. But because he can speak about the abuse and murder of his wife and daughter as if he was just reading off a transcript, it set the alarm bells off that there is a darkness buried deeper within him that can't be removed, like the shadowed bat that's haunted his family. Don't get me wrong, for as much as I'm still hopeful that I'll one day find a comic character called Mad Dog or Marcus that doesn't turn out to be some kind of criminal, I still wanted Amadeus to get revenge. Yet somehow Morrison made me feel guilty for wanting that. This entire time we'd been following the villain, in the same way that the main story doesn't put as much of the focus on Batman. Arkham's facade of pretending to want to rehabilitate Hawkins so that the asylum could get some kind of reputation, only to then kill him when it would look like an accident, was like something out of a Hitman level. Yet Amadeus felt nothing. It helped to humanize the villainous characters by showing how the whole place had been shrouded in villainy from the start. Yet that secrecy about it all meant that the lie became the identity of Arkham Asylum, and history was destined to repeat itself, again showing how the past takes precedent over the present day, which is a lesson I'm taking to heart because I'm reviewing this before I go into their main Batman run. The parallels between the past and present was done seamlessly, and when I researched into this book I came across an allegory that all of it works like the levels of a house, with the past being the basement, the stuff people often don't want to see but is fundamental to the structure, and then I don't get the rest of the metaphor. I know, I'm a dumb reader and I get the idea that the villains represent going through the different floors of the house, but I don't want to live in any of this. The upper floors are just as bad as the basement. The only way I can see that comparison working is with how Amadeus is sinking into insanity, whereas Batman is doing everything to rise above it and escape. If anything, that makes the ending of this story all the more bittersweet, as we get the scene of Amadeus putting his mother out of her misery, and then he sees the illusion of the bat, which has very much been the symbol of her insanity. But it was only because of the sacrifice of his sanity that the asylum came to be. The Arkham Asylum is actually Arkham's Asylum, a prison of his own making that he dedicated his life towards, only to have his life confined to it, in a similar way to how the Batman became the perception of the Arkham Asylum, and the symbol of the bat just exists within a different era for a new generation of tortured people who will spend their remaining days there. So it should go without saying that I thought this story was wonderfully written, and doesn't read like a comic from the 80s, or even like the previous Morrison books that I've reviewed so far this year. If I didn't know any better, I'd have thought this was pretty much a prelude to their main Batman run, but over the past couple of reviews, I've looked at where Morrison fits in within this whole British invasion movement at the time, despite Grant being Scottish. But still, if anything, Arkham Asylum seems to be more integral to that linguistic wave that was started by Alan Moore, because the way this is written doesn't feel like what was coming out during this era, with the odd exception. And personally, I feel the leap from Doom Patrol to this is even wider than the one from Animal Man to Doom Patrol. Morrison had trimmed all the fat off the wording so that it's easy to speed through this in less than an hour, and at the same time they allow the art to do the legwork. I have to admit, when I first saw art from this book, I thought Dave McKean's style just wouldn't be for me. On the surface it's grotesque, rough, and yet somehow vague with what it's showing, yet in the context of the story. And because Grant's refined writing style didn't opt to litter every page with anecdotes for the sole purpose of showing off, it forced me to look within the fog that McKean's illustrating is often shrouded within. Then you've got the mixed materials, if that's what I can call it, where paint, watercolour and black and white pencils all come together on the same page, and it's so chaotic and nonsensical that it's the only look that does make sense for a story about an asylum. So many pages throughout this felt like a collage, or reminiscent of a ransom note. And one thing I found really interesting is I don't think there's a single panel of Batman where we see his eyes. Yet with other characters, and in particular the Joker, that's the main thing we get to focus on. All the more so if you get this book in the beautiful Absolute Edition. And if you want to pick this up or any other books and support the channel at the same time, then you can get it from the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below and you can use these codes as many times as you like. To go back to the eye thing, and I think this might be the first time my English Lit degree has been useful to me, but the clear comparison to draw is with the idea that the eye is the window into the soul. Morrison's focus on exploring who these villains are beyond just their headline or gimmick meant that this still felt original despite how long it's been out. And it is just a bit of a shame that Morrison didn't pull more of the focus into the Dark Knight himself, especially with this being their first outing with the character. I wanted more of an indication of who they wanted Bruce Wayne to be, who they wanted Bruce Wayne to be, who they wanted Bruce Wayne to be, who they Bruce Wayne. Written by Grant Morrison and illustrated by Klaus Janson, Batman Gothic was originally published between issues 6 and 10 of Legends of the Dark Knight by DC Comics from April to August of 1990, and the mob bosses of Gotham City need Batman's help. When a murderous figure from the past comes back for revenge, it will force Bruce to confront a part of his history that he'd long since buried. But what if it uncovers a secret that can't be ignored? And if Batman has to align with those that he swore to take down, can Gotham ever recover? A Apologies there for the switcheroo, but like I said at the beginning of this video, it's hard to find an angle to approach Arkham Asylum without it feeling like I'm just repeating what other people have said. But what I found more interesting about it is how Grant had another Batman story that was coming out just a few months after Arkham Asylum that doesn't get as much acclaim. And because we've got the benefit of hindsight and we know just how much work they're going to do on Batman in the career, I thought it'd be interesting to see where they were really at when they started. And in a way it's ironic because Gothic almost works as an antithesis to Arkham Asylum. Batman is front and centre, as is Bruce. There are no big name villains to rely on, and Gotham is the focus. When several of the city's biggest crime bosses are murdered by an elusive figure known as Mr. Whisper, it forces bossman Octavio to assemble the remaining big figures in Gotham to form an alliance, which also includes Batman himself. However, this case touches closer to home than the Dark Knight's had to experience in his crime-fighting journey. Hearing Mr. Whisper being described as a man with no shadow causes Bruce to recall an episode with Mr. Winchester whilst he was a child in boarding school. Vague nightmares of school halls, his father with his mouth sewn shut, and murdered kids forces Bruce to connect the dots. To give us insight into what Morrison may want their Batman to be, it once again has that belief that the past is as important as the present. From the first part, there's a huge focus on his time at private school, and how his father wasn't able to say something before his friend was murdered. There is that hidden history again being brought to the surface, with the connection to a parent who can no longer protect the main character. The fact that childhood and distant parents are so integral in both of these books speaks volumes. And although I can't pull from it too heavily just yet, Grant's later Batman run feels like a natural evolution of that theme, with Bruce stepping into the parent role and eventually being in a similar position as his father is here. In a similar vein, we do get a brief moment in the asylum where Batman recalls leaving the showing of Zorro the night of his parents' death, and it's a complete shift from the Thomas Wayne that we see in Gothic. Although there could be many explanations for this, such as the two stories not being set in the same universe, Bruce losing his psyche as he goes through the asylum, or perhaps a delusion brought about after his encounter with Scarecrow. But to feel like I didn't go into debt at university for nothing, what I can take from this is that Bruce sees a loving, helpful father in his visions, but one that wasn't able to do what he needed in time, whereas the Batman version of his father is harsh, threatening, yet reluctantly does the thing he needs and gets him out of the theatre, showing that difference between the two personas and how they see their usefulness in the world, and also the approaches that they've had to adopt to. Batman is direct and violent, but gets the job done, whereas Bruce has to take that different approach and can't always get results in the same way as his alter ego. All the while, the blame cast upon him as a child adds to the guilt of his parents' death, so all he can do is torture himself or distort the reality to absolve some of the guilt. Yet that theme of self-torment becomes even more prevalent when Gothic is added into the discussion, and it was early on that I wondered if Batman hadn't been the focus of Arkham Asylum because that wasn't Bruce's real prison. One of Batman's first lines in that book that stuck with me most is when he remarks to Gordon that if he is walking into the asylum could feel like being at home, and the Joker even later comments that there's always space for him there. His family home is where the nightmares torment him, whereas the rooftops of Gotham is where he's calmer and more composed. There's a whole room full of broken clocks where time literally stands still that Bruce forces himself to sit in the same way that the cells of Arkham have no concept of time. So I believe the reason Arkham Asylum didn't focus much on Bruce is because that's where he's more comfortable. If you want to truly explore a character, you have to place them in a situation where they're forced to confront their innermost thoughts. The exploration taking place in Arkham Asylum is more to do with how those villains are viewed and confronting that reality, rather than Bruce questioning who he really is. And the reason I bring this up is because identity plays a key role in both stories. It's more interesting because I spoke about how that factored into Doom Patrol and Animal Man, and here too because the main plot doesn't push the boat out as much in that sense. I'm sorry Grant, but Batman falling into the Joker's trap or hunting down a murderer doesn't exactly scream groundbreaking, but these books are still considered that because of the way that Morrison built these stories around the complexities of these characters. What this says to me, especially in this journey of Morrison's career, is that Grant's depiction of Bruce is the trauma, whereas their view on Batman is used for the impact he has on others, with that persona even tainting the memories from his childhood. Neither Gothic nor Arkham Asylum rely on the philanthropy, the playboy persona, or even the businessman image that Bruce has cultivated in other stories, and instead uses him to show how Batman is both an outlet and way of shielding himself from his hurt, and I'm interested to see if that will remain Grant's focus when writing Batman later in the career. Furthermore, the objective of Gothic is to discover the identity of Mr. Whisper, because when the mob bosses twig that they're being targeted, they call upon the Batman with an inverted signal and propose possibly the worst deal I've ever heard of in my life. The crime bosses of Gotham promise to halt their activities whilst Batman hunts Mr. Whisper, and then they'll just Go back to committing crime? Wow, thanks for that one. So you'll stop being my problem whilst I solve your problem, and then you'll go back to being my problem. Can't lie, if I was Batman here, I'd be tempted to join up with Mr. Whisper. And I'm always trying to be fair in these reviews, but if there is one thing that bugged me between both of these books, it's that Morrison's Batman doesn't really feel like Batman. He repeatedly falls into traps, gets beaten up real easy, and even announces himself when he walks into rooms. He seems more sadistic too, especially in Gothic. Like, we get a few scenes where he seems to revel in people getting killed. Don't get me wrong though, we still get a lot of great scenes with Detective Batman. I even used this fact behind the meaning of the word Gothic to impress Shadowcat, but this still isn't the tactician Batman I like seeing. So it will be interesting to see how Morrison handles that side of him when they have more time with the character. This criticism in particular is most evident in the scene where Batman first confronts Whisper, which happens shortly after the mob bosses talk with Batman. I get that this guy has super strength and has lived for hundreds of years, and may have caught Bruce off guard because of the history together, but Batman's gone up against the likes of Killer Croc, Superman, and countless other ridiculously strong beings, so it's hard to believe he can be so shit at fighting in this. And whenever you have any point about Batman losing a fight, you find this subdivision of the internet that's like, oh, but this Bruce has only been in the role for 17.5 years, and it was a full moon that night, and there was no prep time. But it just doesn't feel very Batman, and I wonder if that's why Bruce took more of the focus here, and The Dark Knight was more the vehicle in Arkham Asylum. And especially with having the two books to compare, it felt like they both had the goal of taking the Batman lore in a darker direction, but in two very different ways. Gothic didn't feel out of place for a Batman book in the early 90s, from the structure to the plot to the look of everything. Yet the subject matter of Gothic, with the details of various assaults, brutal murders, child grooming, and everything else that this 5-issue story gives us, is something I believe wouldn't have passed by the Comics Code Authority easily, and a large part of that is because of the art. Klaus Janson is a name I normally hear in the same sentence as Frank Miller, but I think his style stands well on its own, while still reminding me a lot of what we saw in The Dark Knight Returns. It feels quite obvious to say it's almost the polar opposite style to McKean, and more reminiscent of other Batman books from this time, but in a way it's like the look of Gothic represents what came before, whereas Arkham Asylum is reflective of the postmodern experimentation era that comics were testing the waters with following Watchmen. And honestly, I liked a lot about the style of Gothic, especially when there's establishing shots like bird's eye views of Gotham were great, and I wish we could have had stuff like that in Arkham Asylum to really compare the styles. But the lack of them does help that book feel more isolated and claustrophobic, whereas Gothic's wider shots add to that sense that Mr. Whisper could strike from anywhere. That also adds to the story when the history from Austria comes into play, and there are scenes with Batman analysing Gothic architecture as he tries to understand the origin of the killer that he's hunting. And on a smaller scale, I found it interesting how references were clearly used in both books, because I could have sworn that I saw Ted Bundy's smudged face in a panel of Arkham Asylum, and Graziano looked a lot like Ottavio, and both look like Marlon Brando. And are you telling me that that isn't the beautiful curve of the 89 Batmobile? Although, can anyone explain why the ears on the cowl were so thin? Like, the wind would push them over. What's best in this sense is that Janson and Morrison use that intertextuality with the art, because when the last surviving mob boss sets up a meeting with Mr. Whisper that he wants Batman to be present for, it's actually a trap that I genuinely can't believe the world's greatest detective didn't see coming, to the point where he literally just walk through the front door? Whisper ties Batman into a trap based on the stylings of Rube Goldberg and Heath Robinson that Grant was so particular about that they sketched out exactly what the device should look like. But to be honest, it reminded me a lot of the one from Goldfinger. I do have to admit though, as dumb as it's going to make me sound, I struggled with the book around this part because I just could not read the cursive writing during the flashback. I know, out of all the experimental things Grant tries, this was the biggest hurdle, but you're talking to a guy who has to write in block capitals because I can't read my own handwriting. But beyond that, I felt the connections to literature were far more noticeable here than they were in Arkham Asylum. You've got the obvious ones with the quotes at the beginning of each chapter, the references to literature throughout the story, and even with the nun revealing themselves to be Lucifer. There's also something quite operatic about the whole thing, especially in the final scenes when, after Mr. Whisper is taken care of, his very real heart is delivered to Wayne Manor. Because he's a billionaire who doesn't need to worry about buying a last-minute ticket, Bruce flies over to Austria to throw the heart into the lake spoken about earlier in the book. There is not a funnier ending to a Batman book that I've read than him flying all the way over to Europe, to throw a heart into a lake. Forgive me if I missed all the beautiful symbolism there. But you know, if you're in Europe and you've got a more sensible hobby like, I don't know, buying omnibuses and collected editions, then I'd definitely recommend checking out the channel's European sponsor, Comics Bugle. They've been a huge support to this channel and they can be to you as well, because if you use code WOOFWOOF, you can get 3% off all items that aren't already in a sale. And they've also recently launched the new rewards program that means that you get points back for every order that you place. They're definitely worth checking out if you're in the EU, so get your orders in. So when all is said and done, Gothic was an enjoyable slice of Batman, but felt it was only elevated because I was reading it alongside Arkham Asylum. That's why I feel comfortable labelling it as the present phase for their early Batman storytelling. It felt firmly rooted in what was at the time, pushing the boat out inch by inch, showing who Batman was up until that point and what made his stories resonate within that noir thriller setting. But let's be honest, I'm not doing this whole Grant Morrison because they've got such a great reputation for maintaining the status quo. All of this has been to see how they were ahead of the time and managed to influence comics as a whole. So here we are, back where we began at the Asylum, now with a better understanding of who Grant saw the Dark Knight as, and that was helpful because I was surprised just how animalistic and rage-filled Bruce is in this. But it's not a million miles away from the Batman scene in Gothic. As soon as he enters the front door of the Asylum, he's confronted by the Joker. A mere touch from him unleashes a tirade from Batman, and this doesn't feel like I'm following a stoic, unbreakable man. If anything, it's highlighting the fragility in his character before he's even started Joker's maze. This portrayal of Batman is one that seems to have drawn concerns at first, especially if the introduction is anything to go by, but I feel that evidences how the book was ahead of its time and fits within that postmodernism movement. In the years since Arkham Asylum, the psyche behind the cowl is often as integral to a story as anything that Batman does within Gotham. And again, much like in Gothic and the other Morrison books, I can't help but connect it to the theme of identity and how our perceptions can often be distorted. Yeah, it feels like such a broad and easy theme to just point at, but Morrison themselves stated that the portrayal of the Dark Knight here was a critique of how often he is characterized as hyper-violent and constantly teetering on the verge of insanity. And if that truly was their goal, then they definitely accomplished that. Batman straight up broke that mutated thing's leg just for getting too close.
I can't let you get close.
And the scene I found most interesting in this regard is when Batman breaks a window so he can stab his hand to tear himself away from his nightmare. A far cry from the trap he's strapped to in Gothic that he breaks out of by just breaking out. But at the same time, the self-harm shows how Batman would rather endure that pain than relive his nightmare, tying back into the idea that Arkham Asylum isn't the worst prison for him. But that's why it's disappointing that Arkham Asylum is such a short read, because although it means I can read it fairly quickly and a few times to script this video, a lot of this story felt rushed. There's too much going on and too many ideas floating about that means these situations feel like trailer moments, and it could be quite jarring. Batman's pretty much insane and at his breaking point from the second that he enters the asylum, rather than it feeling like a natural progression. I did hear how this was originally meant to be longer, and even heard about how Robin was supposed to be included until McKean vetoed it, and Morrison does a lot with the page count that they have, but still, it can make some of these bigger moments feel unearned. And in a way, a scene as jarring as that is similar to how Arkham Asylum feels tonally. Sure, there have been Batman books since this that have worked within different genres, but this book is firmly rooted as a psychological horror thriller, and it doesn't try to be anything else. This very concept was something critics laughed at and thought wouldn't work. Again, with Morrison having the last laugh in their introduction, it was another attempt to push this character forward into a new genre. I'm speaking very broadly here, but it's hard to find a Batman book released before this that didn't primarily root itself as a superhero or detective story. Sure, with the work that was done by Adams, Moore and Miller, Batman's story identity was increasingly seen more as a noir, which is exactly where Gothic fits in. So the reason why I feel so confident in saying that Arkham Asylum is a clear indication of what Grant wanted Batman stories to be is because he'd shown us what they had been up until that point. If we didn't know, would we honestly say we thought both books were from the same writer? Because for as enjoyable as Gothic was, there wasn't much that made it stand out from other Batman stories beyond the intertextuality. Whereas even today, Arkham Asylum made me immediately uncomfortable with how different it is, despite the very real fact that Gothic was released after this, but that doesn't help my argument, so we're just going to ignore that. But the reason why I'm banging on about identity so much is because that to me is a key part of what signifies the shift in tone for comics, and one that Grant contributed towards a lot. Like, does this book get to take credit for the Three Jokers concept? Because although I still feel that the Killing Joke did more for his character, Grant did pose an interesting idea with the theory that the Joker creates a new personality each day, which only adds to his insanity. There's no way to know his real identity because he doesn't either, which is the perfect subversion to the postmodernism idea. It's taken the Joker beyond the page and treating him like a concept. If the viewer of this new age of comics was to understand more about these characters, flesh them out and pull them away from a stereotype, then the Joker not conforming to this idea and having the psychiatrist acknowledge that they'll likely never know his true identity is probably the most postmodern thing Grant could have done to advance the Joker. Beyond that, the developments weren't contained just to his characterization, but his very dialogue. Yep, I haven't read every story with the Joker since the 1930s, so it could have happened before, but removing the text box so that he has his own way of speaking was jarring and immediately cast him apart from everyone else. A few others have a similar treatment in this book, but not to the same extent, and it added to that increasing sense of uncanny comfort that came with the asylum, because the longer the book went on, the easier it became to read his words. But what I found most interesting when looking at these theories is how well the book subverted that expectation around the identity of what makes a main villain. As Batman trudges through the levels of the asylum and survives encounters with numerous members of his rogues gallery, he reaches the top of the tower and learns that Dr. Cavendish had orchestrated the whole ordeal. Everything. Even from the Joker being the face of the plan to draw Batman in. Although I'm sure there have been countless comics before this with a third act true villain reveal, it's particularly interesting because of the way it subverts expectations regarding who the evil mastermind is. If it had been the Joker all along, there'd have been no surprise. He's the clown prince of crime, but Cavendish was introduced to us as a hostage, and one of the staff specifically there to help those admitted to the asylum. For him to be the one to come up with the plan, to the point where it was mad enough to convince one of the walking embodiments of insanity to go along with it, illustrates this push towards a more postmodern story. By comparison, there's something Scooby-Doo about Gothic, with the mysterious new villain happening to be the coincidental new character that we're learning about in flashbacks, and I think that contrast between how the two books handle the main villain illustrates the difference in intentions well. There's also that idea that the ones we are inherently supposed to trust, like a doctor or teacher, can often do more damage if the responsibility is corrupted. This isn't too dissimilar to the message of Watchmen, which is still rightfully praised to this day for the way it pushed the boat out with this idea. Yet where Mr. Winchester had to create an alter ego and become a supervillain, Cavendish does it as himself. This in and of itself shows how Arkham Asylum was taking bold steps to subvert the narrative from comics of the past, and there's no better example to highlight that than Grant's other Batman story from that time. What's more is that this book bucks the trend of the labels characters are associated with. They don't just fit into either being a hero or villain. Cavendish goes from respected doctor to manipulative criminal, and Two-Face in the final moments of this story evolves from a rigid villain to a merciful savior, one who literally subverts his own ideology. This comes about after Batman overcomes Cavendish and he frees all of the inmates after he learns of their mistreatment. Which, was that the only option he had? Couldn't have taken them to Blackgate or have some of the GCPD watch over the asylum until they get a new doctor? Like, I get the asylum isn't great, but I don't think that releasing everyone's the answer. Is he stupid? Anyway, Batman returns Two-Face's coin to Dent since it was taken away from him as an attempt to get him to consider more than two options for a situation, which was ingrained within his identity. And in another really ballsy move, Batman leaves his fate in the hands of the coin. Dent, after flipping it, declares Batman free to leave, only to reveal in the final page that the coin had sentenced him to death. You know what? I loved this ending. As soon as Batman put his life in his hands, I thought it was brainless. But when I read this a second time, it's because at the end of this journey, Batman still holds hope that he can change. And this was the biggest test of that. All of the work the nurses had gone through to get Harvey to use a die, and then eventually a deck of tarot cards, didn't work as well at redeeming the human side of Two-Face, as well as simply believing that humanity was still within him, rather than only seeing him as his condition. What's best is that the subtext was obvious enough for a dumb reader like me to grasp, even if part of me is wondering if I'm making any sense. It's undeniable, just like in Gothic how the past influenced the present, with Cavendish reading the journal of Amadeus and using this as justification for his heinous acts. What this says to me is that although comics were moving forward and writers like Grant were ushering in this postmodern era, the past can't be forgotten. It is what everything's been built upon regardless of how far removed it is. Even the biggest fight in this story between Batman and Croc is just a backdrop for the snippets from Amadeus' journal. Yeah, saying this out loud makes me understand the house analogy a little more, but to me I feel like instead of a house, the book is structured more like that of a person. The stuff with Amadeus is the lower body, which carries the weight of everything else. Joker's plot and everything involving the supervillains is a torso, which houses the heart, organs, and everything else needed to survive. Because let's be honest, what would this book be without those characters? Yet Cavendish's storyline is the head, the thing guiding everything else and also resting upon it all. I don't know, that idea sounded better when I thought of it, but I get yes, that's why I consider these two Batman stories to be Grant Morrison's true homecoming. It was the best middle ground between the clean storytelling displayed in Animal Man and the grandiose meta-concepts and literary references toyed with in Doom Patrol. Yet at the same time, there was resistance from fellow comic writers, critics, editors, and even the illustrator working on the book. They didn't have the keys to the kingdom like they had done with the lesser-known properties, but they still found a way to craft a one-of-a-kind story. In many ways, it's a subversion of what I'd experienced in Doom Patrol, where that was a series that relied so heavily on the concepts and intertextuality to the point where the story is nonsensical without that knowledge. Arkham Asylum still tells a fascinating, albeit rushed story, and if the reader didn't know about the influences from European cinema or Philip Larkin, they could still follow Batman on this psychological trip. The surface may be thin, but there's so much waiting beneath that, and honestly, I'm not sure if I've unpacked everything I wanted to about this book. But now, more than any of their previous titles I've reviewed, I feel like Grant Morrison has finally arrived. They've tested the waters with limitless restraint, had a crack at the biggest name over at DC, and after this, the last thing they would be in the comics industry is invisible. Regardless though, I'm glad I read this, and it gave me the opportunity to theorize and figure out what was going on beyond the page. And who knows, maybe I'm the crazy one for thinking about it this much.